The purpose of this video is not to teach you all the specifics of applying CSS. That will take us a period of time, and we'll work on that throughout the semester. What I want to do here is really just get you conversant on the concept of CSS, why it is so powerful, why it's a great tool for us as web designers. CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheet. And
Whatever.
its job is really to implement style to the page. As I've mentioned in the past, HTML is all about structure. It's defining that this content goes here, it's going to be contained in this type of an element which defines it to a certain extent, but it doesn't really give it style. In the old days, it did.
Well, smack my mama.
Everything was defined by HTML. And that's why when you look at old web pages, they look pretty darn funky. It was a rather limiting way to apply style to your page. It was also very labor intensive. So CSS really gives us great control, and it also reduces the amount of labor it takes to apply the style throughout, the page you're working on, or even through your entire website. Now, cascading refers to the idea that elements inherit attributes or qualities from elements that they're inside of. So, for instance, say you define in the body that the type you're going to use should be Helvetica. Well, all the other elements that are inside of the body will also be defined as using the font Helvetica, unless you specifically write a rule for that element saying, no, don't do Helvetica, do this typeface instead. Cascading also refers to the idea that if you write a rule, say you write a rule to change something to do with a paragraph element, well, you write the rule once, and then that rule will cascade throughout the entire document. And so you write it one time, and it can be applied hundreds or thousands of times. So let's get into Dreamweaver, and I'll show you a little bit more specifically what I'm talking about. I've zoomed in real close here so that you can see the code easily, and then how things will change as we apply the styles. So let's start off over here on the left in the code view, and just look at the rules that have been created so far. And so here's the body element. So it's saying in the body element, this is the style I want you to apply. So the background color should be this, and that's the red you see over here. The font family I want you to use is Georgia, and that is the style right here. The color, meaning the color of the font, should be white. And then margin, I gave it some margin. The top at 75 pixels, the right 0 pixels, the bottom 0, and the left margin should be 25 pixels. So that's all been defined and already applied. Now, these other rules have not been applied yet. So why would this be applied and this wouldn't? Well, if you look down in the HTML code, there's very little at this point. You'll see that the only element that exists down in the HTML code is the body element. And so it says apply these to the body element. It finds the body element. It applies these styles. These styles here are looking for a P element, H1, H2 elements. You don't see any of those down here, so while the styles or the rules have been created, they cannot be applied yet. So let's just start applying those, and then we can look to see what happens. So I'm going to go down here, and on the line, this is paragraph, I'm going to wrap this in a P element and click the refresh button, which is out of screen. And you'll see it returned the line down underneath it. And the reason for that is that this was just plain text. It was not wrapped in any elements at all. If you remember, a browser doesn't understand multiple spaces. It doesn't understand returns in the code. So all of these, even though they had returns, it just recognizes that as a single space. So the minute I wrap this in a paragraph element, if you remember that's a block level element, it puts it on its own line and then puts these two lines of text underneath it. So let's just look at the style of this then. Well, the style isn't any different, is it?
No way.
It's just been defined as 16 pixels, and that kind of happens to be the default. So now let's move on and do the H1 element. and refresh. All right, so let's look at how this has changed and why it has changed. This is an H1 element, so I'm going to look up here. There are two rules that can affect that H1 element. So these rules here would apply to every single heading. So H1 through H6, if you have an H element on it at all, it will end up being in the font family Helvetica. So this established the font family as Georgia, but that was the first rule. This rule was applied next and therefore replaces the previous rule. And so this has now become Helvetica. H1, color black. And so again, the color of the type was established as white for the body, but that rule is a previous rule. This is a new rule, so that replaces the type being white, and it changes it to be black. And of course, the larger size is because it's a heading, specifically a heading 1, as opposed to a paragraph element. All right, so let's go ahead and do an H2. Refresh. And we'll see something entirely different happens here. So this being an H2, the font family stays Helvetica, but the color is white again. So why is that? Well, because I didn't specify the color of the text in the H2 element. So therefore, it inherits that quality from the body element. So this style cascades down to the H2 element. But I did change one thing, and that is I gave it a background color. And that background color is a dark red, and so you'll see behind this line, this H2 line of type, it now has a background color of red. That's what the idea of cascading refers to. As you create a series of rules, the rules at the top will apply to everything underneath it unless you give it another instruction to say, nope, don't do that. This is what I want you to do here. You probably noticed that the CSS rules have a very specific style to them. In other words, they need to be written in a very specific way. And so I thought this was a good point to maybe go in and talk about that. What you see on the screen now to the left is what's called a selector. And that means that it tells the browser, it's like, okay, go look for this element and select it, and then this is what I want you to do to it. The next part of the rule is called the property. So you're saying to the browser, okay, go to the body element, and then inside of the body element, I want to change the background color property. And then finally, you need to tell the browser what you want to change it to. In other words, give it a value. So you have your selector, and then you have your declaration, and the two parts of the declaration are the property and the value of the property. And so you'll see it's written here in but a single line in the code we were looking at earlier, and we'll look at again in a minute. You'll see that it's broken up into multiple lines. Remember, browsers really don't understand line breaks. It's written in the code the way it's written so that it's easiest for us to understand and see. But you could very well write the rule just like this in a single line, and it will work the same. It's important you understand that there are different types of selectors, and you can even combine selectors together to create what are called compound selectors. The first selector I want to talk about is called a tag selector, and that's what we looked at just a little bit ago. It's saying go find this particular tag. And so we were looking at the body element, the paragraph element, the heading elements. Those were tags that we were going and finding and selecting. Class selectors a little bit different. Class selectors are elements that you define within the context of something else. So that could be a div, or in the example here on the screen, that could be a span. And a span just means you're selecting part of an element. I'll show you more specifically in a minute. So class selectors apply the rule to an element whose class attributes match the one specified. If I wanted to modify a series of elements in my HTML code, I would give them a class of, in this case, highlight. And everywhere that the browser finds a class of highlight, then it would apply the rule. Now, one nice thing about class selectors is that you can use them as many times as you want. There's no limit. However, ID selectors, that is not true. You can only use an ID selector once. So it's very similar, in fact it's very much the same in how you would apply a class, except in this case you are applying an ID, but you can only apply that ID once. In context of our class, we will most often use IDs to style a div. Okay, so let's look at some of these selectors in action. So the first type of selector I wanted to show you is the one we've dealt with already, and that is the tag selector. And so if you look up here, there is a rule, or actually I should say there are 4 rules have been applied to the body element. And so the first 2 are really just to strip out any margin or padding that the browser may want to automatically put in there. I don't want the browser to put any in there, so I just say, take it out, please, make it be 0. I've established a family, a font family, which we'll use Cambria this time. And then finally, I've established the color of the type. And so if you look in the window over here, you will see that all those things have occurred. I've got brown type in Cambria, and there's no margin and no padding. If I go down here, you'll see that I have various elements in position. So here's the body element, and then here's a div with an ID of text box. There are several paragraph elements in here, and then there are a few spans. And so remember, spans are inline elements where you can label a certain part of an element and then give it a class or an ID. And so that's what I've done here. Now these rules aren't taking effect because you'll notice that those rules are currently grayed out. Those rules have been what's called commented out. If I uncomment these, then I can start to see these rules in action. So this first rule right here, and let me just go ahead and turn that comment off. So this first rule here is a class selector called highlight. And if you remember, class selectors can be applied multiple times. And so this is what those span elements are relating to. So you'll see the name of the class is .highlight. That's how you indicate it's a class, by the period in front of the name. But you'll see the structure of the rule is identical to the tag selector up here. And then if I come into the code, you'll see here's a span, and it's been given an attribute of class, and the class is being defined as highlight. Okay, so this is going to be applied a few times. There's one here too, and then here's another one down here. And so if I click the refresh button now, which is out of screen, you will see that highlight being applied over here in the design view. All right, so that's highlight, is all it's doing is giving a background color to the text, but that's now being applied. Okay, so I have one more rule here called text box, and this one has a hashtag or a # in front of it. Well, this is an ID selector. And so let me uncomment that. And this is going to apply to the div. So all of this type is currently in a div, which is right here. It's inside the body, but surrounding all of the text. And so if I go all the way to the bottom, you'll see there is the closing div tag that started way up at the top. And so it's been given an ID of text box. And so here we are, ID text box. So you can tell it's an ID because it has that #. And if you remember, this can only be applied one time. So I can't apply it to anything else. The width is 500 pixels. The margin at the top is 75. The margin on the right and the left is auto, which means it will center it in the page horizontally. And then the margin on the bottom is 25 pixels. I've also given some padding. So padding is inside of the box so that the type doesn't go all the way to the edge of the box. So I've given padding of the top, on the top and the bottom of 15 pixels, and I've given padding on the left and the right of 35 pixels. And finally, I've given the div a background color. Okay, so let me refresh the page and you'll see how those rules impact this div. So pretty dramatic change, isn't it? This is a very simple page with very simple rules, and you can see that you can dramatically affect the look of the page. Okay, it's time for our bonus question. CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheet. What's the difference between an internal style sheet and an external style sheet? Good luck. An internal style sheet is what we've been working with so far and will continue to work with throughout the entire semester. It's just simpler when you're learning to keep your styles in the same document as your HTML code resides. However, once you move to a more advanced level of web design, you're most often going to want to have your style sheets not be internal. And the reason for that is an internal style sheet, just resides in the head of your HTML page, but it can only apply to that one individual page. Now, there are times when you would like it to apply to more than just one page. And yes, you can do save as of your pages or copy and paste, but there's a better way to do it. And that is with an external style sheet. And so an external style sheet resides in its own file. It's a .css file, and you can import this style sheet into as many pages as you want. So it's not uncommon to have a style sheet that may apply to your entire website, which could be hundreds of pages. And the power of this is that you create the rule once, and instead of just cascading through a single document, it can go through your entire site, which may be thousands of instances. So say you want to change an H1 element to be blue instead of orange. Well, if you had to go to every single page and you had hundreds of pages, that would be very time consuming. But if you can change the rule once in an external style sheet, you can then apply that rule over and over and over again to unlimited number of pages. It's very powerful. So I hope that's the answer that you gave to the bonus question. If so, congratulations. That's it for this overview of CSS. Like I said, this is really just meant to give you an understanding of the concepts of how it works. It takes a while to get a feel for this, and there will be other movies on how to apply CSS, and of course we'll be working on this in class a lot. But hopefully this gave you a good start.
Yeah.